Good morning, Sam Tenpenny with Tri-State Livestock News, the Fence Post, and Farmer and Rancher Exchange, bringing you today's daily headlines concerning fair cattle markets. By unanimous vote on Thursday, the U.S. House Agriculture Committee passed the bipartisan Cattle Contract Library Act of 2021. Introduced last week by Representative Dusty Johnson and Representative Henry Cuellar, the Cattle Contract Library Act would establish a library of contracts for the Agricultural Marketing Service to report terms of alternative marketing agreements between the packer and the producer. Supporters of the bill say that it would greatly increase transparency in cattle markets, as cattlemen are currently unaware of contract terms being offered by packers, which Johnson credits for the decline in leverage for smaller producers during price negotiations. The legislation would require the Agriculture Secretary to establish and maintain a library or catalog of each type of contract offered by meat packers to producers for the purchase of fed cattle, including any schedules of premiums or discounts associated with the contract. The measure would require that all collected information from type of contract and base price to the transportation arrangements be made publicly available, and also requires that the USDA publicly report the total number of cattle that beef packers have committed to them both 6 and 12 months into the future. AgWeb reported Representative Johnson saying the bill is a result of nearly a year of work with producers and industry leaders following the July 2020 boxed beef and fed cattle price spread investigation report, which recommended the creation of such library. During an interview with Chip Flory on AgriTalk Thursday, NCBA Director of Government Affairs and Government Regulatory Policy, Tanner Beamer, said the Cattle Contract Library has broad support from all sectors and that it has been a longstanding priority for NCBA. While the National Cattlemen's Beef Association came out in support of the bill, other industry groups were less enthusiastic. According to Farm Progress, RCAF is the only cattle industry group to not support the bill as approved by the committee. RCAF's board of directors reviewed the bill and determined that it does not address the competition disrupting leverage that the highly concentrated beef packers currently hold over the cattle market, and that modern methods of cattle procurement being used by these large beef packers may fall outside the scope of the bill. The problem with our broken market is not that we don't know the details of the contracts that confer market leverage to the packers. The problem is there are too many contracts, and because of that, our price discovery market is being destroyed, said Iowa cattle feeder and RCAF director Eric Nelson. Nelson says Senate Bill 949, also known as 5014 bill, addresses this serious problem by increasing the volume in the price discovery market and decreasing the volume of contracted cattle, which forces the meat packers to compete in the price discovery market by purchasing at least half of their cattle from that market and then slaughtering them within 14 days so they're not able to use those for captive supply cattle. He said that the mandatory country of origin legislation is also needed and that a contract library could be helpful, but only after a competitive market is established. Farm Progress reported Nelson reiterating that putting a contract library ahead of taking action to preserve the price discovery market sends a signal that more contracts are good and more producers should try to access them, which is not necessarily what the organization believes is needed. Likewise, the North American Meat Institute withheld support for the bill entirely until further understanding the implications of its requirements. President and CEO of the Meat Institute, Juliana Potts, said more time is needed to consider how the bill will affect livestock producers, feedlot operators, packers, and processors. Due to the limited time allowed to consider the legislation, on behalf of the North American Meat Institute, Potts asked the House to pause and include packers in the conversation, stating that the packers would be the ones bearing the burden of complying with this new government mandate. The bill comes as Congress begins to lay out what it hopes to include in the livestock mandatory reporting bill set to expire on December 3rd, but must be approved by the full House and would also need Senate consideration before it can be signed into law. National Beef Wire reported cattle and calves on feed for the slaughter market in the United States for feedlots with a capacity of 1,000 or more head totaled 11.6 million head on October 1st, 1% below October 1st, 2020's inventory, but the second highest October 1st inventory since the series began in 1996. The inventory included 7.07 million steers and steer calves, down 3% from the previous year, but accounting for 61% of the total inventory. Heifers and heifer calves accounted for 4.49 million head, up 2% from last year. Placements in feedlots during September totaled 2.16 million head, 3% below 2020, while marketings of fed cattle during September totaled 1.79 million head, 3% below last year's numbers. AP News reports in the November 2nd election, voters will be asked if they favor an amendment to the Maine Constitution to declare that all individuals have a natural, inherent, and unalienable right to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume the food of their own choosing for their own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being. The proposal is essentially the Second Amendment of food, said Republican Representative Billy Bob Falkington, who proposed the amendment, likening it to the U.S. constitutional amendment that assures the right to bear arms. He said it's a common sense amendment that would make sure the government can't stop people from doing things like saving and exchanging seeds as long as they don't violate public or property rights. Falkingham and others say the amendment is a response to growing corporate ownership of the food supply and a way to wrestle control from the big landowners and giant retailers. Depending on who you ask, Maine's proposed right to food amendment would simply put people in charge of how and what they eat, or it would endanger animals and food supplies and turn urban neighborhoods into cattle pastures. For supporters, the language is short and to the point, ensuring the right to grow vegetables and raise livestock in an era when corporatization threatens local ownership of the food supply, a constitutional experiment that has never been tried in any state. For opponents and skeptics, it's deceptively vague, representing a threat to food safety and animal welfare, and could embolden residents to raise cows in their backyards in cities like Bangor and Portland and other more populated areas. Julie Smith, executive director of the Maine Farm Bureau, the largest farmers advocacy organization in the state, argued the language of the amendment is so broad that it could make the food supply actually less safe. That's a problem in a state where potatoes, blueberries, maple syrup, and dairy products are all key pieces of the economy, she said. The amendment could empower residents to buy and consume food that isn't subject to inspections, proper refrigeration, and other safety checks. Smith emphasized the organization's unrest over the language to consume the food of your own choosing, stating that it's too broad and dangerous with the potential to cause serious problems in food safety and animal welfare. Smith said the Farm Bureau is also concerned that the amendment could override local ordinances to prevent residents from raising livestock anywhere they choose. Mark Brewer, a political scientist for the University of Maine, agreed with criticism that the amendment is so vague that it's unclear what it would actually do. I'd be more interested in how it plays out in the courts, Brewer said. If you want to raise cattle within city limits when the city law says you can't, but the Constitution says you can, then what happens? For Penobscot farmer Heather Retberg, the concern about cows turning up in cities is a silly distraction from the real goal of the proposal. This shifts the power to the individuals in a rights framework instead of the corporations, Retberg said. It gives us more voice in how we want our food systems to be and how we want our communities to look. Supporters of the proposal, including Falkingham, said that the local rules would still be enforced and that the amendment would not mean that you can do things like raise chickens anywhere you want or fish commercially without a license. The amendment proposal is an outgrowth of the right to food movement, often called the food sovereignty movement, which has expanded in recent years in Maine and states around the U.S. and Canada. The movement comprises a patchwork of small farmers, raw milk enthusiasts, libertarians, back to the land advocates, anti-corporatists, and others who want to ensure local control of the food systems. Maine enacted a food sovereignty law, the nation's first of its kind, back in 2017. The law allows local governments to okay small food producers and selling directly to the customer on site. The law was especially popular with sellers of raw milk, which can be legally sold in Maine, but is more restricted in other states. The nationwide food sovereignty movement has yielded similar laws in states such as Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, and North Dakota, with pushes for the same elsewhere. Capitol Press reported that the drought has taken its toll on hay production in the Northwest. John Driver, an industry analyst formerly with Northwest Farm Credit Services and Washington State University and founder of Hay King's social media group, commented during a Hay Outlook webinar hosted by Northwest Farm Credit that forage production saw a lot of disruption this year, especially in dryland areas such as Montana, southern Oregon, eastern Washington, northern Idaho, and California's Imperial Valley. We know that hay inventory was already low in Montana, and then we compound that with a second year of drought and greater intensity. USDA's latest crop production report suggests the situation will worsen in Montana, where alfalfa production is forecast down 46.9% year over year on 50,000 fewer acres. The state's other hay production is expected to be down 38.4% despite an additional 10,000 acres planted. Montana isn't alone. In Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, alfalfa production is expected to be down 5.8% on an additional 30,000 acres, while production of other hay is also expected to be down 14.3% across the region. The drought's impact will also be felt outside the Northwest, while California's other hay production is expected to be down about 4%, not a drastic reduction, but it is lower. Idaho's other hay production is forecast down about 34%, a several hundred-ton shortfall in that dryland grass hay, while the USDA forecasts Oregon's other hay production 10% lower than last year as well. Driver highlighted the different climate regions in the state of Oregon, but noted that even on the west side of the state that grass hay production was down because of temperatures well over 100 degrees, with instances of 118 degrees in the state of Washington. Those high temperatures extended into the Willamette Valley and along the west coast of Washington, where hay production was subsequently down in each of those regions. Other hay production in Washington is largely irrigated grass hay on the west side. The exception is the northeast corner, which got hit particularly hard, Driver said. While he's not sure he agrees with the USDA's estimate of Washington's grass hay production only showing a slight decline, he emphasized the big picture here is that production is significantly lower in all of these production regions. While high temperatures offend irrigated alfalfa just as much as dryland production, Driver noted that when you add in smoke from the wildfires, that one can only expect alfalfa tonnage to be down even on irrigated production. USDA's forecast of about a 9% decline in Idaho's alfalfa production does seem right to him, but he's not so sure about the agency's forecast of a 10% increase in California. He also thinks that alfalfa production will be lower in Oregon than USDA's forecasted 3.6% decline, as there were irrigation shutoffs in the Klamath Basin, a large alfalfa producing region, despite other valleys having more normal production while still subject to high temperatures and smoke. According to the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, the demand for livestock loans grew in the third quarter, boosting agricultural lending activity at commercial banks. Demand for operating loans was more subdued, however, and total non-real estate lending remained near its average of the past decade. The average size of loans for some livestock categories reached an all-time high and contributed to the increased lending. While the average size of operating loans also remained elevated, a smaller number of loans limited the overall financing of operating expenses. The U.S. ag economy generally remains strong as elevated commodity prices continue to support farm incomes. Although prices of most major crops were at multi-year highs moving into fall harvest and supported farm revenue prospects, weakness in the cattle industry persisted as low cattle prices continued to limit profit margins for producers, while concerns about drought and higher input costs continued to intensify and likely contributed to an increase in the producers' financing needs in the livestock sector. The volume of non-real estate farm loans increased in the third quarter, but some types of lending remained limited. Total non-real estate lending was about 8% higher than a year ago, but has declined at an average pace of about 2% over the last 4 quarters. A large share of the increase during the quarter was due to the increase in loans used to finance feeder livestock and other livestock, which grew by about 20% and more than 50% respectively. The increase in livestock loan volumes was driven by larger loan sizes. The average size of loans for other livestock continued a sharp upward trend, increasing about 30% in the third quarter, reaching an all-time high. The number of other livestock loans was also higher than a year ago, but did remain historically low. Similarly, the average size of feeder livestock loans has increased steadily over the past year, but the number of loans has declined for the 4th straight quarter. While the size of livestock loans increased sharply, the growth in the size of operating loans was much less pronounced. The average size of operating loans remained elevated, but was only about 5% larger than it was a year ago. The number of operating loans continued to trend downward and remain historically low, limiting any gains in loan volumes. Alongside an increase in loan sizes, interest rates remain low and loan durations were higher than recent averages. Rates charged on all types of loans except operating loans declined slightly from a year ago and reached an all-time low for the third quarter. The average maturity type of all loans except machinery and equipment loans were higher than a year ago as well. Until next time, I'm Sam Tenpenny, and this is your Fair Cattle Market Update.